Few philosophers have more obviously changed the world than Hegel, both personally through his influence on German nationalism and indirectly through the work of his most famous philosophical disciple, Karl Marx, after whom a great many governments in our own day actually call themselves. So if we want to see some of the practical consequences of Hegel's ideas, all we have to do is look at the world in which we ourselves live. His influence on philosophy was correspondingly great. In fact, it's been said that the history of philosophy since Hegel can be understood as a succession of varying reactions against his work. He was born in Stuttgart in 1770. A teacher of one sort or another for most of his life, he eventually became professor of philosophy at Heidelberg and then in Berlin. As a philosopher, he was a late developer, but by the time of his death in 1831, he was very much the dominant figure in philosophy throughout the whole of Germany. The titles of some of his most influential works are The Phenomenology of Mind, The Science of Logic, The Philosophy of Right, and The Philosophy of History. Hegel had several followers who themselves became well known, but far and away the most famous is Karl Marx. Marx was born in Germany in 1818, and as a young student of philosophy was very much a Hegelian. He didn't become a socialist until his mid-20s, when he began to develop that rich and highly original mixture of German philosophy, French politics, and British economics, which is Marxism. Together with a wealthy young industrialist, Friedrich Engels, he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The partnership between Marx and Engels must be just about the most momentous collaboration in the history of ideas. Engels kept Marx for most of his life so that he could produce his writings, and it was a life spent largely in exile because of Marx's political activities. At the age of 31, he went to live in London and stayed there until his death in 1883. He's buried in Highgate Cemetery. For many years, he worked in the British Museum in its reading room, and it was there that he wrote his masterpiece, Das Kapital, published in 1867. Marxism isn't quite philosophy in the accepted meaning of the term, but there's obviously a major philosophical element in it, and that element always remained Hegelian. What I propose to do in this program is devote the bulk of the discussion to Hegel, and then show how some of the most important of the ideas we've been discussing were incorporated into Marxism. With me to do this is someone who has published excellent introductions to the works of both thinkers, Peter Singer, Professor of Philosophy at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Professor Singer, Hegel is notorious for being difficult to read, for being obscure. He's often described as the most obscure of all the major philosophers. Yet your little book about him has the conspicuous merit of discussing his central ideas in ordinary plain English. And I hope you're going to be able to do the same on this program. When you're confronted with the task of expounding Hegel's ideas, where do you find the most convenient place to start?
I start with the philosophy of history, because the history in Hegel is quite concrete. Part of the difficulty with Hegel is that he's so abstract, but the history, because it's concrete, is an easy way in to the more abstract parts of his philosophy.
Well, that in itself is already a new departure in philosophy, isn't it? Because no major philosopher before Hegel regarded history or the philosophy of history as being important.
Yes, it is a departure. Compare it with Kant, for instance. Kant had a view of human nature as human beings eternally divided between their reasoning element and their brute desires. It's a bit like the old picture of man as halfway between the apes and the angels. And for Kant, that was just a fact of human nature. We would always be torn with this division, this conflict. But Hegel said, no, wait a minute, this isn't something immutable. Look at Greek society. Greek society, Hegel said, was more harmonious. People were not conscious of this gulf or division. Their desires were in harmony with their reason. So the point that Kant is talking about, this division, is something that has occurred historically, has developed with the rise of individual conscience in Protestant Europe. And because it's happened historically, it need not be a permanent feature. It could, in some other period, actually again be overcome and a harmony restored.
Hegel looked at all important concepts in this historical way, didn't he? He saw them as being embedded in human life, in ways of life, in societies, and as societies change, so the concepts change. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. He saw that there was development in the way history occurred, that it was always moving forward. It was always a process, never static.
And he had a name for the way in which it moved forward. He called this the dialectical process. Now, can you explain exactly what, in Hegel's mind, the dialectical process was?
Let's go back to the example I mentioned before. Greek society he saw as a harmony, but as a simple harmony. A simple harmony in the sense that people had not developed the alternative notion of individual conscience. There was harmony between the individual and society because individuals hadn't really thought about things themselves. Now, into that simple harmony, there came, in the person, in fact, of Socrates, whom Hegel considers a world historical figure, there came the idea of questioning this harmony. Socrates went around asking people, what is justice? What is virtue? And when they tried to answer, they realized that they'd accepted certain conventions which Socrates had no trouble in showing could not be sustained. So the simple harmony of Greek society broke down, and because Socrates broke it down, incidentally, Hegel thinks that the Athenians were quite right to condemn Socrates to death. He was genuinely corrupting and subverting Athenian society. But that was an essential part of a historical process, because ultimately, and Hegel fills in the gaps, the steps, but ultimately that led to the rise of individual conscience, and a second necessary element, and the opposite of Greek society. So we've moved from what Hegel calls the thesis to the antithesis. The antithesis of Greek society is individual conscience risen to its height in Protestant Europe. But that too turns out to be unstable. It leads to the destruction of the French Revolution and the terror that followed the French Revolution. And so that too must give way to a synthesis, to a third stage, which combines harmony and individual conscience. And very often in this process, that then again serves as the new thesis from which a further antithesis will arise and the process will continue.
Now, this notion of dialectical change that you've just explained has been so influential ever since Hegel, and it's enormously influential today through Marxism, which embodies it, that I think we must get it completely clear in our minds. So let me just go over it again. The idea is, isn't it, that Hegel put forward that the reason why we human beings are involved in a process of perpetual change is that every complex situation contains within itself conflicting elements, which therefore destabilize the situation. And therefore the situation cannot go on indefinitely. It breaks down into something else within which those conflicts are dissolved or assuaged. But then, of course, in the new situation, you get new conflicts. And so it goes on indefinitely. So you get, as you put it just now, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which becomes a new thesis using his terminology. And this, Hegelians and following them Marxists think, gives us the key to history, to understanding historical change, the dialectical process. Now, up to that point in the explanation, it would have been open to Hegel to say that the direction that this change took was purely accidental. It could be the random outcome of innumerable random conflicts. But he doesn't say that, does he? He actually thinks this linear process has a direction, has a goal.
That's right. And the goal for Hegel is the greater development of mind towards freedom. We are moving always towards consciousness of freedom, towards realizing human freedom and understanding freedom. And that is a process of increasing awareness of freedom and of increasing knowledge of ourselves.
Now, what is this change happening to? I mean, wherever we talk of change, in any context whatever, there must be something identifiable that changes. Now, what is it that's changing? In other words, is he writing about whole societies? Is he writing about individuals? What is he writing about in this context?
The short answer is that he's writing neither about individuals nor about societies, but about what he calls Geist. Now, that German word Geist is a difficult one to translate. The easiest way, perhaps, would be to say that it happens to mind. Mind is one normal translation of the German word Geist. We mean, when we talk about mental illness, the German word Geisteskrankhaft is mentally ill. So you could say it's happening to mind, to your mind and mine, or all our individual minds. But mind also has another meaning, which goes beyond that. The notion of spirit. We talk about the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Or we talk about Geist when Germans talk about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The word Ghost
Heiliger Geist.
Heiliger Geist, exactly.
Yes.
So it also has, therefore, a somewhat spiritual or religious flavour, which suggests that in some sense there's a reality above and beyond your and my individual mind. And so you could say it's happening to mind, but mind with a capital M, not just mind in the sense of individual human minds.